She was just 14 years old, found alone on the side of a quiet highway in Texas in 1980. No ID, no name, no one looking for her. At least, that's what it seemed. For more than 4 decades, she existed only as a question, a case file, a sketch, a name that wasn't really a name at all. Walker County Jane Doe. And for 41 years, nobody knew who she was. But here's what makes this case even harder to understand. Even after investigators finally gave her name back, even after science did what time could not, there is still one question that has never been answered. Who did this to her? Because this wasn't just a case about a missing identity. It was about a young girl who somehow traveled hundreds of miles from home and ended up alone, in a place where no one recognized her, no one reported her missing, and no one could explain how she got there. And for decades, the people who found her, the people who investigated, and even complete strangers, kept asking the same thing. How does someone disappear without anyone knowing? On November 1st, 1980, a man driving along Interstate 45 near Huntsville, Texas, noticed something unusual off the side of the road. At first, it didn't look like anything important, just something lying in the grass. But when he got closer, he realized it was a person. She was a teenage girl, alone, unresponsive, and very quickly, it became clear. This was a crime scene, and authorities arrived and began their investigation. They searched for identification. There was none. No wallet, no documents, nothing that could tell them who she was or where she came from. But there were small details. Details that would stay with investigators for years. She was wearing a red blouse, blue jeans, and a necklace. Simple things, but nothing that could lead to a name. At first, investigators believed identifying her would be simple. A girl that young, someone would report her missing, someone would call, someone would recognize her face. But days passed, then weeks, and no one came forward. No missing person report matched her. No family contacted authorities. No one claimed her. And that's when the case took a turn no one expected. And because it wasn't just that they didn't know who she was, it was that no one seemed to be looking for her at all. Over time, investigators created a sketch, a reconstruction of her face, hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize her. The image was shared across newspapers, across different states, across communities. But still, nothing. She remained unknown, unidentified, unclaimed. And slowly, Walker County Jane Doe became more than just a case. She became a mystery that time refused to solve. But what investigators didn't know at the time was that this case would remain frozen for over 40 years. And the answer to who she was wouldn't come from witnesses or confessions. It would come from something no one in 1980 could have imagined. DNA. For investigators in Walker County, this wasn't supposed to last. A teenage girl found along a major highway should have been identified within days, maybe weeks at most. But something about this case didn't follow that pattern. Because the more they looked, the less they found. No matching reports, no familiar face, no one calling to say, "That's my daughter." And that's when a quiet concern started to grow inside the investigation. What if this girl didn't come from Texas at all? They began expanding the search, checking missing persons reports not just locally, but across state lines. And slowly, a possibility started forming. This girl may have traveled a long way before she was found. But that only raised more questions. How does a 14-year-old girl travel that far, alone? And more importantly, Who was she with? Witnesses came forward, of people who believed they had seen her in the days before she was found. Some said she had been asking for directions. Others said she mentioned trying to reach a prison in Huntsville. That detail stood out, because Huntsville was home to one of the largest prison systems in Texas. And suddenly, investigators were looking at a completely different possibility. Was she trying to visit someone? If that was true, then this wasn't random. This girl had a destination, a reason to be there. But no one knew who she was supposed to meet. No prison records matched her description. No visitor logs showed her name. And that's when the investigation started to slow down. Not because they stopped trying, but because every direction led nowhere. Weeks turned into months. The sketch was updated, shared again. Still no answers. And slowly, the case began to fade from urgency into uncertainty. But there was one thing investigators couldn't ignore. This girl had a story, a journey, and somewhere, someone had to know who she was. As the years passed, Walker County Jane Doe became something else. Not just a case, but a name people remembered, even though it wasn't her real name. Locals visited her grave. They brought flowers. Some even gave her a nickname, Precious. Because even without knowing who she was, people refused to let her be forgotten. But memory wasn't enough. Because while the community remembered her, the case itself was growing colder. Leads stopped coming in. Tips dried up. And the question that once drove the investigation began to fade into silence. Who was she? And for decades, that question remained unanswered. No name, no family, no explanation. Until something changed. Not in the case, but in science itself. Because years later, a new method would emerge. One that could do what no witness, no record, and no investigation could. It could give the unknown a name. Years passed. Then more years. The world moved on, but this case didn't. Somewhere in Walker County, her file still existed. A thin folder, holding everything that remained of a life no one could name. And inside it, the same questions investigators had asked from the very beginning. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why did no one ever come looking? By the late 1980s, the case had already gone quiet. No new leads, no new witnesses, just silence. And as time continued to pass, that silence became something heavier. Because with every year, the chances of finding her identity the traditional way started to disappear. But there was one thing investigators held on to: evidence, carefully preserved, stored away. Not because they knew it would solve the case, but because they hoped one day it might. At the time, DNA technology was still in its early stages. It wasn't something you could rely on to identify someone without a reference. And in this case, there was no reference, no family, no database match, nothing. So the case remained frozen. Through the 90s into the early 2000s, Walker County Jane Doe stayed exactly the same. A girl without a name. But outside of this case, something was changing. Quietly. Science was advancing. DNA technology was becoming more powerful, more precise, and more importantly, more connected. And because investigators were no longer limited to direct matches, now they could look at distant relatives, build family trees, trace identities through connections, instead of waiting for someone to come forward. For most people, this was just progress. But for cold cases like this one, it was something else. It was a second chance. Because suddenly, Cases that had been silent for decades were starting to speak again, and eventually, Walker County Jane Doe became one of them. Her case was reopened, not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, but because of something that had been there the entire time: her DNA. The sample was sent for advanced testing, and for the first time in over 40 years, there was movement. Real movement. Not speculation, not theory, but data, connections, and a path forward. But even then, this wasn't instant. It didn't give them a name overnight. Instead, it gave them fragments, small pieces of a much larger picture: distant relatives, shared DNA, possible family lines. And from those pieces, investigators began building something they had never had before: a direction. And as those connections became clearer, one name started to stand out. A name that had been missing for more than 4 decades. A name that would finally answer the question that had remained unanswered since 1980. Who was she? For over 40 years, she had no name, no past, no identity, just a case file, and a question that refused to go away. But now, that was about to change. And because after months of careful analysis, comparing DNA, building family connections, and narrowing down possibilities, investigators finally reached something they had never had before. A match. Not a direct one, but close enough to begin tracing a real person. From that point, everything began to move faster. Family trees were built, records were checked, connections were confirmed, and slowly, the unknown girl from 1980 started becoming someone real. Not a sketch, not a label, a person. Her name was Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was 14 years old, from Stillwater, Minnesota, hundreds of miles away from where she was found. For decades, no one had connected her to that roadside in Texas. No one had realized that the girl they were searching for was the same girl who had already been found. And that raises a question that still doesn't have a clear answer. How did she get there? What is known is that Sherry left home in 1980. She was young, trying to find her way, like many teenagers do. But somewhere along that journey, something went wrong. The distance between Minnesota and Texas is not small. It's not something a 14-year-old crosses without encountering people along the way, which means someone saw her, someone spoke to her, and possibly someone knows more than they've ever said. When investigators confirmed her identity in 2021, it brought answers, but it also brought something else. A deeper sense of how much had been missed. Because for 41 years, Sherry Ann Jarvis had been known by the wrong name, Walker County Jane Doe. And now, that name was no longer needed. After decades of silence, she finally had her identity back. A name, a story, a place in the world again. But even with that, something was still missing, because knowing who she was didn't answer the one question that started all of this. What happened to her? And more importantly, who was responsible? After more than 4 decades, the question of who she was finally had an answer. But the question of what happened to her remains. Because even now, with the name restored, with a story partially uncovered, the person responsible has never been identified. And that changes everything. Because this case is no longer just about an unknown girl. It's about a known victim and an unknown killer. Somewhere, there is someone who knows what happened that night. Someone who saw something. Someone who remembers details that were never shared. Back in 1980, there were reports that Sherry had been seen in the area, possibly speaking to people, possibly trying to reach a destination, which means her final hours were not invisible. They were witnessed. And yet, those moments were never fully understood. Time has a way of changing things. Memories fade, details blur, people move on. But sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And cases like this have a way of coming back. Because what solved her identity was something no one in 1980 could have predicted. And that raises another possibility. If science could give her name back after 41 years, then maybe, one day, it could do the same for the rest of the case. Until then, this case remains open, not forgotten, not closed, just waiting. Waiting for the one piece of information that changes everything. And maybe that piece of information is something someone already knows. Maybe it's a memory, a detail that didn't seem important at the time, or something that was never spoken about. Because in cases like this, even the smallest detail can matter. For 41 years, she was known as Walker County Jane Doe, a name that was never meant to last that long. But today, she is no longer unknown. Her name is Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was 14 years old, and for decades, the world didn't know who she was. Now, it does. And somewhere, the rest of her story is still waiting to be told.